Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into a stack of source material drawn from the book 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos. Our mission in this deep dive, well, it's really to unpack some of the core ideas, maybe some surprising insights, and, those memorable stories from these excerpts. The aim is to help you navigate complex thoughts and maybe see the world, well, a little differently.
Yeah, it's a deep exploration, definitely. Looking into how we structure our lives, how we make sense of things.
Hmm.
And it draws on a really wide range of perspectives.
Yeah.
The material here, it certainly makes you stop and think.
It really does. Okay, let's unpack this. So, the author of this book, he's described in the sources as a learned person, someone who thinks aloud, actually enjoys being challenged. Definitely not presented as like a typical dry academic or egghead.
Right. And the book itself, it has this really interesting origin. It started out as answers he posted on Quora, that Q&A site.
Oh, really? Just from Corey Answers?
Yeah, he started with something like 40 answers he'd written there. And then apparently over 3 intense years of editing, including what's described as some vicious and horribly accurate criticism, he basically boiled those down to the 12 essays, the core rules in the book.
Wow, that's quite a process. And the title itself, right? 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos. That gives you a pretty clear signal up front, doesn't it?
Totally. It points straight to this fundamental idea that runs through all the material. People need ordering principles.
Yeah.
We need structure in our lives.
Because chaos is always there.
Exactly. The sources really emphasize that. Chaos is the unexplored territory. It's the unknown. Full of potential, sure, but also dread, and what the source calls dreadful freedom.
Mm.
So to balance that, we need order. We need rules, standards, values, routine, tradition. That's the order part.
The known territory.
Precisely. The explored territory, the social hierarchy, the structure from our biology, culture, home, tradition, even just politeness. It's where the world mostly works the way we expect it to.
Okay, so the goal then, according to these sources, is to kind of exist right on that edge, that line between the two.
That's the idea. They call it the straight and narrow path.
Mm.
And that's the place this material suggests, where we're stable enough, but also exploring enough, transforming, repairing, cooperating. It's right there on that specific path where we confront both order and chaos that we find the meaning. The meaning needed, they argue, to justify life and all its inherent suffering.
Which leads us perfectly, actually, to Rule 1. Stand up straight with your shoulders back. Now, on the surface, this sounds, well, almost comically simple, maybe even a bit cliche.
Right, but the material connects it to something surprisingly deep, like really deep. It dives right into neurochemistry.
And not just human neurochemistry either. This
Yeah.
is where the source brings in lobsters.
Lobsters, yes. Okay, this part really caught my eye. Tell us about these philosophical crustaceans. Well, the sources explain that even for a lobster, its posture, whether it's confident and standing tall or kind of cringing and defeated, it's tied to the ratio of two chemicals in its little brain, serotonin and octopamine.
Serotonin and octopamine in lobsters, so it affects their brain chemistry, just like ours, or similarly.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
So winning a fight for a lobster actually increases that serotonin to octopamine ratio.
Makes them cocky. Is that the idea?
Huh. Yeah. The sources actually describe a lobster with a high ratio as a cocky, strutting sort of shellfish.
Mm.
Seriously. They're much less likely to back down from the next scrap. And serotonin helps regulate their posture, so these winning lobsters literally extend their limbs, stand tall, they look bigger, more dangerous. Dex is like Clint Eastwood in a spaghetti western.
Standing up straight. Okay, I see the connection now. So how does this link back to us, to humans?
Well, the argument is that our own, like, really ancient brain structures,
Yeah.
what's called a primitive counter in the text, it still assigns us a kind of dominance number. And it does that based, partly at least, on how we physically hold ourselves.
So if you slouch, like a defeated lobster.
If you slouch around with that defeated posture, others unconsciously see lower status. And your own brain registers a low dominance number internally.
And the consequence of that low number, it's not just perception.
No, it's a powerful feedback loop. It actually leads to less serotonin in your brain, which means increased anxiety, sadness. It makes you less likely to assert yourself, less likely to stand up for yourself. It basically confirms that low dominance number, both to you and to everyone else.
Wow. So it's not just about appearing confident. This material is suggesting your posture can genuinely change your internal state. Your brain chemistry, how you feel, how you act.
Yes, exactly. It becomes this self-reinforcing cycle. And The interpretation of Rule 1 here goes even deeper. Standing up straight isn't just a physical thing. It's framed as a conscious decision, a decision to voluntarily face the chaos of potential and turn it into, habitable order. It means accepting the burden of self-conscious vulnerability, stepping away from the maybe simpler state of childhood, and taking on the sacrifices needed to build a meaningful life.
That is a lot packed into just standing up straight. Quite an interpretation. Okay, let's shift gears a bit from individual posture and lobsters to something much heavier, the duality of human nature. Our capacity for amazing good, but also for, well, profound evil.
Yeah, the material really digs into this capacity for evil. It uses the interpretation of the Adam and Eve story. The serpent in that story isn't just seen as, a talking snake. It's presented as Satan, the embodiment of evil itself.
Right, and the interpretation of God's curses in that story, that's quite different from maybe more traditional readings, isn't it?
Very different.
Yeah.
Yeah, the sources describe God's curses after the fall as being merely descriptive. Descriptive of evolutionary and biological realities that sort of came online with human consciousness.
So not punishments, but descriptions.
Exactly. Like
Right.
painful childbirth and the incredibly long dependence of human babies. That's not seen as a punishment. It's framed as a biological consequence, attributed to this evolutionary arms race between bigger brains needing bigger heads and the mother's pelvis needing to stay narrow enough for walking upright.
Ah, okay.
And that long dependence, it meant infants needed mothers for way longer than other primates, which in turn increased the mother's dependence on men. The material notes this means women pay a high biological price for child rearing, sometimes having to rely on the unreliable and always problematic good graces of men. That's a direct quote.
So these aren't seen as arbitrary divine punishments, but descriptions of the tough biological and social reality that came with consciousness. The knowledge of good and evil.
That's the framing. And within that, the sources zero in on what they call the best definition of evil, which is voluntary malevolence, inflicting suffering for the sake of suffering. That capacity, they argue, is uniquely human.
That's a chilling thought. And does that connect somehow to the idea of original sin?
Yes, the material uses this specific interpretation, this voluntary malevolence idea, to, and I quote, well-nigh legitimize the concept of original sin. It highlights this sense of existential guilt we seem to carry, this awareness of our potential for wrongdoing. And that's presented as a key thing distinguishing humans from, say, psychopaths who apparently lack that guilt.
Okay. But the sources don't just leave us there in the dark side, right? They contrast it pretty quickly.
Immediately, they contrast it with something they see as, well, nothing short of a miracle. Everyday heroism.
Everyday heroism, like what?
Right. There are anecdotes mentioned, like a disabled man consistently helping another man with a degenerative disease. Or, individuals just quietly and productively coping with really serious health issues. Families somehow managing to pull together and function even during devastating crises.
So not epic heroes, just
Yeah.
regular people facing immense difficulty and choosing what exactly?
Choosing not to give in, choosing not to fall apart. The source finds it genuinely miraculous that most people, despite facing so much suffering, disappointment, loss, inadequacy, ugliness, they refuse to just degenerate into resentment and hatred. That active refusal, that constant choice to keep going with fortitude, with perseverance, that's presented as this ongoing miracle.
It really makes you think about the sheer, often invisible weight that people are carrying around every single day.
Absolutely. And the material argues that humanity genuinely deserves sympathy for what it calls the appalling burden of our mortality, the potential for state tyranny, nature's random cruelty. It's an existential situation, totally unlike what animals face. The source suggests it would take a god to fully bear it. And recognizing this shared immense difficulty, they argue, should give us a necessary balance to self-contempt.
So it's a tough balance, acknowledging the potential for evil, but also this profound human strength and perseverance against suffering.
Yes, people do prevail. They do the incredibly hard things needed to hold themselves together, their families, society. And a key takeaway offered is that you, the listener, you're important to others just by enduring and trying. And you deserve respect for that.
Okay, let's shift focus a bit now. How do these ideas play out in our social lives, in relationships, and specifically this really crucial topic of setting limits? The source kind of kicks this off with a pretty relatable observation about dismal teenage parties getting out of hand fast.
Right. It highlights how easily things can degenerate when clear boundaries aren't there or aren't enforced. And this leads into a really significant point about the complexities and maybe the pitfalls of trying to save other people.
Right, because normally you'd think, put someone who's struggling into a really positive environment, and it should lift them up, shouldn't it?
That's the intuitive thought. But the material brings up this analogy from psychology research. Moving a worker who's performing poorly onto a really stellar team. The psychological literature, according to this source, actually shows the team tends to degenerate. Not that the newcomer improves, because, quote, down is a lot easier than up.
Wow, down is easier than up?
Yeah, and the same principle is applied to, say, placing a delinquent teen among well-behaved peers. The delinquency is apparently more likely to spread than the stability is.
So this really brings up a tough question the source seems to be pushing. When we try to help someone, especially if it's repeatedly against the odds, are we really doing it out of pure altruism? Or is there maybe a part of us that's just trying to feel virtuous or strong?
Exactly. The material suggests these attempts might sometimes be driven more by a desire to appear strong or generous, rather than a clear-eyed understanding of what that other person actually needs or is even capable of receiving right then.
Okay. Another big pitfall the source highlights, comparing yourself constantly to others.
Yeah, this is presented as often just completely inappropriate because your life, your situation, your challenges, they're unique to you. And that internal critic, that harsh voice we all have, it uses comparison unfairly. It'll take your absolute worst on one dimension, maybe your job situation,
Right.
and compare it to someone else's absolute best dimension, maybe their perfect-looking family life online. It creates this totally distorted, demoralizing picture.
And gratitude is offered as a kind of antidote to that.
Yes, actively valuing what you do have instead of
Mhm.
constantly overvaluing what you lack, that's highlighted as having utility in gratitude. It's framed as a protection against falling into that victim mentality, into resentment.
Okay, let's move to setting limits. The sources are pretty direct here, especially when it comes to child discipline.
Yeah, there's a strong argument made that children aren't just these perfectly good beings who you can just leave to their perfect natures.
Yeah.
That's not the view here. They'll naturally push boundaries, they'll fight sleep, they'll use food or defiance to test limits, maybe for attention or power. Kind of like juvenile chimps, exploring the social structure.
And the idea isn't that strict limits crush creativity. I think that's a common worry.
No, the material actually cites literature suggesting the opposite, that strict limitations facilitate rather than inhibit creative achievement. The idea is that limits provide a secure structure, a predictable world within which creativity can actually flourish, rather than this kind of terrifying, unbounded chaos.
There's a very specific, maybe even startling anecdote shared about discipline involving a spoon and a poke.
Right. The author describes this persistent struggle with his infant son over eating. The son wasn't eating enough, wasn't sleeping well, the whole household was disrupted, so the author decided he had to establish a clear boundary. He prepared for, like, a war, deciding to take the spoon back. He describes gently but persistently poking the child's lips with the spoon until, eventually, out of sheer frustration, the child would open his mouth to, howl in outrage.
And at that exact moment,
At that precise moment, the author would pop the spoon with food in,
Mm.
then use his finger across the child's lips to kind of help ensure some of it got swallowed.
That sounds incredibly intense for everyone involved. What was the outcome described?
Well, the material stresses the goal wasn't punishment. It was establishing necessary limits for the child's own well-being. After apparently significant wailing and struggle over several meals, the child started to eat, eventually just collapsed, exhausted. And, the author notes, quote, he liked me a lot better when he woke up than he had before he was disciplined. The point being made is that setting those limits, even when they're really tough, can actually reduce anxiety for the child by making the world feel more predictable and secure.
And there's a similar story about a cousin's child, right? Howling for an Elmo video.
Yes, where the parent just refused to give in to the tantrum, refused to reward the bad behavior with screen time. When the child was howling standing up in the crib, the instruction was simply lie down or I will lay you down.
Mm-hmm.
The source makes the point that, scared parents think that a crying child is always sad or hurt. But sometimes kids are just testing boundaries or being strategic to get what they want.
So these stories really emphasize that establishing clear, firm boundaries is seen as crucial for a child's security, for their development.
Yeah, it's framed as allowing them to discover the edges of the world, basically, which might otherwise feel terrifyingly unstructured.
This idea of potentially harmful protection also connects to how the source interprets the Hansel and Gretel story, right?
Yes, Hansel and Gretel is used as an archetype for the terrible mother. This figure, like the witch, seems kind and protective on the surface.
Offering candy.
Right, offering candy. But metaphorically, she's actually devouring the child's spirit through overprotection, keeping them dependent, naive, preventing their own consciousness and individuality from emerging because they're shielded from all difficulty.
And the danger of being, metaphorically fattened up like that.
The sources suggest that children who are too protected, who never encounter real difficulty or failure or even malevolence, might just collapse when they finally do face it in the real world. They haven't built any defenses, any resilience.
Okay, but despite exploring all this potential for darkness, for difficulty within families, the material also points out something that pushes back against that, right? Abuse doesn't just spread exponentially.
That's right. This observation is presented as evidence for the genuine dominance of good over evil in the human heart. That somehow, despite everything, people often manage to contain the spread of trauma, of destructive patterns, across generations. It doesn't just replicate endlessly.
And related to that, there's also fascinating data mentioned about violence rates over time.
Yeah, the sources point to evidence suggesting that, maybe counterintuitively, humans have actually become significantly more peaceful as our societies got larger and more organized. Hunter-gatherer societies, for instance, often had drastically higher murder rates compared to modern nations.
Really? Higher?
Much higher, according to the examples cited. Like the Kung Bushmen, whose high murder rate apparently dropped sharply once they came under state authority. The interpretation offered is that complex social structures serve to reduce, not exacerbate, the violent tendencies of human beings. Order seems to quell violence.
Interesting. The material also briefly touches on some shifting social values, especially around marriage.
Yeah, it mentions Pew Research data from, I think, 1997 and 2012. It showed young women placing increasing value on having a successful marriage, while young men valuing it actually decreased slightly. And of course, overall marriage rates have declined significantly since the mid-20th century.
Which leads to a question posed in the source.
Right. It asks pointedly, who decided anyway that career is more important than love and family? It highlights a potential societal value shift the author seems to find concerning.
And finally, in this section, there's a critique about relying too heavily on group identity categories.
Yeah, the argument made is that any group identity, race, gender, economics, whatever, can always be fractionated right down to the level of the individual. The material really asserts that every single person is, importantly, significantly, meaningfully unique. And just focusing on group membership can't possibly capture that essential variability.
And this is illustrated with examples.
Yes, like the huge differences in income between various American Indian tribes, which get lost if you just talk about American Indians as one group, or the sheer complexity in defining something seemingly straightforward like disability. These examples are used to show how broad categories can hide crucial individual differences, suggesting we need to focus primarily on the individual.
Okay, let's dive into the power of truth and attention now. These are themes that really run deep through this material, aren't they? A core idea seems to be that even small untruths, even those well-intentioned white lies, they can ripple out and cause big, unintended negative consequences.
Definitely. And this is shown really vividly with that anecdote about Dennis, the author's neighbor, who shows up trying to sell a toaster at 2 in the morning. The author describes this internal struggle right then and there. How do you tell the truth in a situation that's so messy, so complex?
So what was the choice made in that moment?
The decision was to tell the truth, yes, but with a very specific approach. The author describes making a conscious effort to shed any sense of primate dominance motivations or moral superiority. Instead, the goal was to meet Dennis as, quote, two men of goodwill trying to help each other out in our common struggle to do the right thing.
Letting go of the urge to win or judge, basically.
Pretty much, yeah. And just speak honestly, human to human.
And the truth he actually told.
But he refused to buy the toaster. But he clearly explained why. He reminded Dennis he'd said he was trying to quit drinking, and giving him money right then wouldn't help that goal. And he also said, honestly, that Dennis, showing up drunk and late like that, made his wife nervous.
Wow, that's incredibly direct. Must have been awkward. Potentially confrontational, even.
Oh, I imagine so. The source says Dennis just glared for about 15 seconds. But then understanding kind of dawned on his face, and it was all right. So that moment of genuine, difficult conflict born from telling the truth, it didn't lead to resentment. It actually led to respect, according to the account.
That really connects to a concept mentioned earlier, Alfred Adler's idea of life lies. Can you unpack that a bit?
Sure. A life lie, as it's interpreted here, is basically when you try to manipulate reality, how you see it, think about it, act in it, just to achieve some narrow desired outcome you've already decided on. And it's based on what the material argues are two really flawed premises. First, this arrogant assumption that your current limited knowledge is good enough to define what's good for the future.
Right.
And second, this belief that reality itself is just unbearable as it is, and therefore it has to be twisted or distorted to fit your preferences.
And the sources link this directly to arrogance, to pride.
Oh yeah. This tendency to try and force your limited view onto reality is seen as requiring the kind of arrogance and certainty the source attributes to Milton's Satan in Paradise Lost, believing your own flawed ideas are absolute. The rational human mind, the source suggests, is particularly prone to falling into this kind of dangerous pride.
And one of the most powerful examples brought up for the real-world impact of lies versus truth is Alexander Solzhenitsyn and his massive work, The Gulag Archipelago.
Absolutely. Solzhenitsyn's analysis of the Soviet prison system, according to this material, showed this direct causal relationship between the sheer pathology of the Soviet state, its brutality, its irrationality, and the widespread habit of its citizens falsifying their own day-to-day personal experience.
How so? Falsifying their experience.
People denied suffering. They pretended things were okay when they clearly weren't. They adopted the official language of the regime even when they knew deep down it was false. So Solzhenitsyn believed this mass dishonesty, this collective denial of lived reality, was basically what propped up the whole totalitarian system. It aided Stalin's tyranny.
And Solzhenitsyn's response was just to write the truth about it.
Exactly. He wrote the Gulag Archipelago, this searing, incredibly detailed, deeply personal account of the camps. And the sources state this work had such an overwhelming moral force of unvarnished truth that it, quote, utterly and finally demolished the intellectual credibility of communism, at least in the West.
So telling the truth, in that huge historical example, wasn't just personal. It helped shift global ideas.
That's the argument. So telling the truth isn't just framed as like a moral rule here. It has profound real-world consequences, personally and societally.
And personally, the sources argue, telling the truth is vital because it allows your own goals and values to actually change, to evolve.
Yes. If you're blindly chasing some goal based on a lie or just an incomplete picture of reality, you basically cut yourself off from discovering that maybe a different goal would be better, more aligned with how things really are. By telling the truth, by letting reality inform you, your values can transform and you gain the ability to reorient your life, maybe even radically.
Which brings us right to Rule 10. Be precise in your speech. This seems to link truth-telling directly to perception and attention.
It does. The point here is that vision, our attention, it's incredibly expensive biologically, psychophysiologically, neurologically. It takes huge amounts of brain power just to process the visual world. And here's the crucial part. Our brain filters what we actually perceive based on what we're aiming at, what we desire, what we expect. The sources put it really starkly. You are blind because of what you desire.
And those famous psychology experiments illustrate this blindness, like the gorilla suit one.
Yeah, or the server experiment by Dr. Simons. They're classic examples of what's called inattentional blindness. In the gorilla one, people are so focused on counting basketball passes in a video, they often completely miss someone in a full gorilla suit walking through the middle of the game, stopping beating their chest.
It seems impossible to miss.
Right. And the server one is maybe even more jarring. People watching a server behind a counter often don't even notice when a completely different person pops back up after the server ducks down for a second, even if they switch gender or race.
You watch those clips and think, no way I'd miss that. But the research shows, yeah, we probably would.
And the material's point is this. Because our perception is so heavily filtered by our immediate goals and desires, it's entirely possible that, quote, what you really need is right in front of your eyes, but you cannot see it because of what you're currently aiming for.
Wow.
So it suggests if you feel stuck, if you're not seeing solutions or possibilities, maybe your current knowledge isn't enough. Maybe your value structure needs an update. Or maybe you're just holding on to certain desires too tightly. Being precise in your speech forces you to clarify what you're actually aiming at. And that clarification helps you see what you might be filtering out.
Okay, let's try and bring all these different threads together now. This connection between taking action, being aware, and finding meaning. The sources circle back pretty strongly to that idea of ordering your own life first, right? Before you try and fix the world.
Yeah, there's a real call for humility there. The question is posed, if you can't even bring peace and order to your own household, your own life, how dare you try to rule a city?
Hmm.
The focus has to start with your own direct experience, your own sphere of responsibility.
And this involves paying really close attention, bringing us back to Rule 10 and precision?
Exactly. And the advice is very concrete, very practical. Focus on your immediate surroundings, both the external world you live in and your internal landscape, your thoughts and feelings.
Hmm.
Notice something specific that actually bothers you. Then ask yourself 3 questions. 1, is this something I could realistically fix?
Okay.
2, is it something I would actually fix? Meaning, am I willing to put in the effort, however small?
Right, the willingness factor.
Well,
And the third,
Well, those are the 2 main ones. But implicitly, it needs to be something you identified as bothering you. Is it yours to fix?
and if the answer to, could I fix it,
Yeah.
or would I fix it, is no.
The advice is simple. Aim lower. Look somewhere else. Find something smaller, less ambitious, until you hit something that meets all the criteria. Even fixing something tiny, like that annoying stack of papers on your desk you keep ignoring, that's a valid starting point.
And this ties into the strategy of setting really small, achievable goals.
Yes. The material suggests setting a goal as basic as, by the end of today, I want things in my life to be just a tiny bit better than they were this morning. Simple as that. Then ask yourself 2 specific questions. First, what concrete small thing could I do right now that I would actually do that moves towards that? And second, what small thing would I genuinely appreciate as a reward once I've done it?
And then you just do it.
You do it. And here's the crucial part in the instruction. Do it, even badly. Don't wait for perfection. Just get it done. And then this is key. Give yourself that reward you decided on. The example in the text is just that damn coffee. Give it to yourself in triumph.
That damn coffee. It sounds trivial, but the principle seems important. It's not the scale of the reward.
Exactly. It's about reinforcing the positive action, no matter how small it feels. The source actually compares this to compound interest for your life. Doing this daily, even imperfectly, it consistently raises your baseline. Your own standard of comparison shifts upwards. Over a few years, your life becomes entirely different because you're constantly making these tiny incremental improvements.
And this process also helps you see more clearly.
That's the argument. It helps you learn to see. Because, and this idea keeps coming back, what you aim at determines what you see. By taking small, concrete, positive actions towards a better future, you literally start to perceive the world, your possibilities, differently.
The material also gives us a kind of different way to think about memory, doesn't it? Not just as a recording device.
Right. Memory isn't presented as just this passive, objective log of the past, like a video file on a computer. Instead, it's described as an active tool. It's the past's guide to the future. Its main job isn't just to remember historical facts accurately. It's to help you understand why bad things happened, why you suffered, so you can learn from it. So you can avoid repeating those same mistakes or falling into the same traps again.
So that makes really complex questions about the past, like the example given, was I raped 5 times?
Right.
It makes them less about just finding a factual answer and more about interpretation.
Exactly. The source uses that incredibly difficult example to show that questions like that aren't just about recalling events. They involve infinite layers of complexity. Right. Untangling them requires significant exploration, really difficult conversations, deep listening. Because memory is actively shaping how we understand the past, precisely for the purpose of navigating the future better.
And speaking of listening and complexity, the sources talk about how we actually think by talking, and why having a listener is so essential.
Yeah, a listener, in this view, plays this crucial dual role. They're both a collaborator and your opponent.
Collaborator and opponent, how so?
They're collaborating by helping you articulate your thoughts, just getting them out. But they're also your opponent because they test your thinking. They push back, they offer different perspectives, new information. The material even describes it as a kind of meditation during conversation. You're listening not just to the other person, but to yourself. How are you responding? How is this new information changing your own assumptions? What new questions are popping up for you?
So it's a really dynamic process, a dialogue where both people are actually changed by the interaction.
Yes. It's seen as this process where both people, if they genuinely engage and are willing to let go of old ideas when faced with truth, can move together, move towards somewhere newer and broader and better. This constant search for knowledge, this refinement through dialogue, that's presented as the highest form of wisdom. Kind of like Socrates, right? Never claiming to know everything, always questioning. It's why the material suggests always assuming the person you're listening to might know something vital that you don't.
There's also that super saturated solution analogy that gives a really vivid picture of how structure can help someone who feels overwhelmed and confused.
Right. Imagine a glass of water where you've dissolved so much sugar, it's holding way more than it should. It's unstable, supersaturated.
Right.
If you drop just one tiny sugar crystal into that solution, instantly all the excess sugar